Right, hi Year 11. So I'm here to do one of these videos today, just on the final question of the migration paper, question 4, which is the essay question, which is worth 16 marks. Well, it's worth 20 marks because there are also 4 marks for SPAG. So this question is a really important one to get right because it's worth nearly half the marks on the paper. I would strongly recommend you start with it when you begin the exam because it's worth so many marks on the paper. If you have to rush one of the other ones, it's less important because they're obviously worth a lot less marks. You get 4 just for SPAG on this question, okay? And it's definitely one where if you plan well, you can do really well on it. And it's a good question to try and get right, okay? In the exam, you'd have about 25 minutes to do it if you were timing it marks per minute. So it's not an essay in the way that the kind of A-level history essays are, but it is like the longest bit of writing you have to do in the migration paper, okay? So I'm going to sort of talk you through what you have to do for this question using this question as our kind of model, but I'll also put in the video description some other questions you can use if after the video you want to go away and practice writing one, which is what I would strongly recommend, okay? But we're going to be working on this one. You're more than welcome to use it as the question that you plan for, but there are other videos, other questions, sorry, in the video description. Okay, so the question you've got here is, have economic reasons been the main factor in the migration of people to Britain? Explain your answer with reference to economic reasons and other factors. Use a range of examples from across your study of migration, empires and people 790 to the present day. Now, just starts things off with this question. They'll either ask you a question about migration or about kind of empires, so why they expand or contract. This question's a nice, easy one because it's just asking you about the main reasons people have migrated. They might make it in the exam a bit narrower by, say, for example, saying why people have moved into Britain, or they might say the main reasons people have moved out of Britain, or they could try and narrow it down a bit by giving you a slightly smaller time frame than the entire course. So they, instead of saying 790 to the present day, they might say from 1500 to the present day, or from 790 to 1800. So they could make it narrower, but this is the kind of typical question you would get about migration. The thing that might change is the factor in the question. Okay, now 5 key things we're going to be doing in the session today. Introducing the example question we've already done. I'm going to very briefly talk you through the mark scheme, just to sort of give you an overview of what you need to do in the question. We're then going to be looking at some things about how planning is really important with this essay question, and how to plan your overall essay, but then also when you're doing practice essays, how to plan good paragraphs and good introductions as well. And then I'll just finish off with some overall reminders about the structure of your writing and what you should do if you're trying to get top marks. Okay, so on the mark scheme then, this is a sort of simplified version that I've made. Now, you can pause on it if you want to here and have a look at the mark scheme in detail, but I think in some ways it's easier to understand what a mark scheme is demanding by looking at some example answers, and that's what we're going to do in a minute. But just to give you a kind of overview. Now, there's 3 kind of things that they're really marking you on: your knowledge and your understanding, your explanation, so that's your analytical writing basically, and then your structure and argumentation, so that's more to do with like your overall kind of essay writing structure and skills, okay? Now, what they're looking for with knowledge is, and again, we'll start with level 3. We'll talk at the end about what you need to do to get like the top 8, 9, level 8, level 9 grades. But if we can always aim for now for a good level 3 essay, they want to have a range of accurate knowledge. Okay, so accurate means also specific. So that means they want to have dates, events, people, place, statistics. They don't want it to be too vague. And a range obviously means you don't just know 1 or 2 topics quite well. You've got to have a range. You've got to cover a large number of topics from the course in your essay question, okay? The point about explicit relevance is basically you're not just describing a bunch of stuff you know which might be tacitly relevant to what the question's asking. You can really clearly link what you know to what the question's actually asking you. So you're giving evidence, but then you're explaining what your evidence proves. What does it suggest that is relevant to the question? What point are you trying to make with the examples that you bring up in your essay? Okay, so you'd want to have a range of accurate knowledge. You want to have explicit relevance and developed explanations of that evidence, that knowledge. And then finally, just some points about the overall structure. Now, to get a high level 3 essay, okay, you have to write about the stated factor and then at least one other factor, okay? So that means you can get 12 out of 16, which is a 7 or an 8, just by writing an introduction, 2 very good, well-developed paragraphs and a conclusion, okay? It's about quality and depth at that point, okay? I would recommend once you get good at it, trying to maybe do 3 paragraphs, but you can certainly get a level 8 just by doing 2 really, really good ones with a good introduction if you do all the other things well, okay? So what they also want to see besides that, so the factor in the question, and at least one other factor besides that, they also want to have a developed and sustained argument. So that means that you introduce like your overall argument, say in your introduction, and then your main paragraphs, you kind of keep the argument going, you sustain it, you keep it going over the essay. It's not just like a conclusion tagged on at the end of the essay, okay? And then finally, if you want to get in those higher mark bands, you've also got to be able to say, at least suggest at the very least one fact that may be more important. So in the case of the question we're looking at, you'd have to have a conclusion whether you thought economic reasons were the main reason people migrated or not, okay? So those are your 3 main things: knowledge, explanations, and then your structure and overall argumentation. Now, the thing I'm going to say when you're doing these practice questions now is that planning is really important. And just to digress for a minute before we talk about this iceberg planning thing, which I do with my students already. Now, there are kind of 3 basic stages to good writing, or any writing, to be honest. Planning, so actually preparing for what you're going to write, mapping out what you're going to say, collecting your evidence, etc. There is the writing itself, and then there is finally your editing. So when you get feedback on your work or when you look at it because it's a first draft and you re-edit it, that's when you make changes. Now, according to all the sort of best work that's been done on how students write well or how people in general learn to write well, is that good writers spend a lot more time on good planning and editing than they do on writing. Writing itself is actually the least important stage of good writing. If you plan well, it's likely that you'll be able to write faster because you know exactly what you're going to write. You kind of have a framework. It's much easier to get on with writing. So planning might feel like it takes time, but if you do it well, it will make the writing itself faster. So overall, it'll be time neutral because you would have had to spend a couple of minutes planning. But on the other hand, you will write much faster because you know exactly what you want to say and you've given yourself that framework. The other thing is that obviously if you plan well, you're less likely to make silly mistakes. So obviously that means there's less editing to do afterwards, okay? So we're going to put a lot of emphasis on the planning stage of writing today, because I think particularly when you're practicing in non-time conditions to do essays, it's really good to get into the habits of planning, because the idea is that by doing that, you'll eventually develop habits in your writing that you'll do automatically without having to plan in as much detail as you're going to do now. But while you're still learning to do this essay question, I would strongly recommend doing really good detailed planning, okay? Now, with that in mind, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a little thing called iceberg planning, okay? Now, this is just an analogy that I use with my students all the time at A-level for sociology and history, and also my GCSE history students. Now, the reason I call it iceberg planning is with an iceberg, if you don't know, the majority of an iceberg is not actually on the surface, it's below the surface. You can't actually see it. Now, with an essay question like this, a classic students might make sometimes is they'll only write about what's on the surface without thinking about what goes on below the surface. Now, in the case of the question you're planning for here, have economic reasons been the main factor in the migration of people to Britain? Explain your answer with reference to economic reasons and other factors. Now, the point here is that if you get blindsided, you might only write about all the economic reasons you know why people moved to Britain, okay? But the point is that's only one thing you're going to write about. You've got to make sure that you see below the surface and get that actually, for our course, we know there are all these other factors which have caused people to migrate, okay? So war, religion, government, policy, technology, and inventions. All of these things have played a role in migration. So you've got to make sure that you're not just planning for what's on the surface. You get the idea that there are other factors which might not be explicitly mentioned in the essay question, but you are going to have to write about in order to get top marks. That's why they give you that little prompt in the after writing about explain with reference to economic reasons and other factors. They're trying to remind you and nudge you that you've got to think about the things below the surface which aren't embedded in the question. Okay, so that's why it's really important to know these themes off by heart. Okay. Now, there's a little planning sheet here, which I'm going to show you an example of it finished. My students have seen this already. I will attach this in a Google Doc in the video description again, so you can take this little list off and see an example of it completed on here in a moment, okay? Now, what I like to do is a few things when I'm planning for an essay question like this, okay? You want to make sure that you underline the key words from the question, so you think, right, first of all, what's the key factor here? Right, I'm looking at economic reasons, right? And were they the most important reason why people migrated to Britain. So that's a really important first stage, okay? So you're underlining the keywords from the question and thinking about what the question's actually asking you, okay? Now, what you then want to think about is you might want to make a little sketch like this, like an iceberg, and say, right, well, okay, so here's your iceberg drawn out on a piece of paper. You can just do this on your own little scrap bit of paper. You don't need to have the sheet that I've attached to do this. And you want to say, right, let's start off with what's on the surface. So let's think about the economic reasons why people have migrated to Britain in that time, okay? So what I've just written down here is some initial ideas what I could look at the Vikings and the economic reasons why they moved. So the fact that they wanted, there was a shortage of fertile land in Scandinavia, and they obviously wanted the farmland in Britain, which was more abundant. They also came for economic reasons because the first Vikings who came, we know, came as raiders to take gold and slaves. And we also knew the issue of primogeniture, okay, the fact that in Scandinavia, younger sons didn't inherit any land, so they had to go off to places like Britain in order to better themselves and enrich their families. Likewise, you could look at as an economic reason why people moved the Irish migration that was caused by potato blight, and also the fact that Britain was going through its industrial revolution, so it encouraged a lot of Irish people to move over to mainland Britain in order to sort of benefit from that. And you could also look at it at an example of economic migration, looking at Caribbean migration after World War II. So you could look at the issue of poor wages in the Caribbean because of the sugar plantation economy, and then the fact that Britain itself was pulling people towards it because it needed workers to take part in post-war reconstruction. So I've just jotted down some initial ideas about, okay, so here's my examples of economic reasons why people moved to Britain. So I could build my entire paragraph around just these examples. I had to have some more specific depths and stuff, but those would be all really good examples of economic reasons. You can probably think of other examples of economic migration to Britain besides these three, which you might well want to write down. Now, the point is, though, that I'm going to plan out for at least two other factors besides the one in the question. So if the question's asking me to look at economic reasons, I'm going to go below the surface and say, well, what are some of the other factors that we know from the course? So we know, for example, war is a big cause of migration. I haven't written about this one here, but you would be more than welcome to do one on that. Likewise, we know that technology has played a role in facilitating migration in some stages at least. But the two I've written about here are examples of government policy encouraging migration to Britain, and also the role of religion, and particularly religious persecution in people moving to Britain. So I just brainstormed and said, right, so government policy, what were some examples of government policy leading to migration to Britain? So we could say, well, we know with the Huguenots, for example, that the policy of the French government to tear up the Edict of Nantes and carry out a policy of persecution led to lots of Protestant Huguenots in France leaving. I could also look at the examples of the fact that Elizabeth in England actually had a policy of encouraging Huguenot migration because she wanted them for their economic skills. Okay. Likewise, I could look at the idea that with the Caribbean migration example, that was also partly the result of government policy. So you could look at the British Nationality Act, for example, of 1948, which gave citizenship to people throughout the British Empire in order to encourage them to freely move to Britain to take part in post-war reconstruction. I could also look as an example of that, the policy of the Danelaw, which was established by Alfred the Great after he defeated the Vikings. So obviously that allowed the Vikings to peacefully settle in Britain and allow their migration to be long-term. So those would still be some examples of government policy which encouraged migration. And then likewise, I could finally just brainstorm a couple of ideas about, okay, so what were some examples of religion that led to migration to Britain? So we could think about the Huguenots being forced out by the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and the Edict of Nantes. So you could talk about the Huguenots and how they moved to Britain because of religious reasons to do with persecution. You could also look at, for that one, Jewish migration in the 19th century, so how the pogroms in Eastern Europe, particularly after 1882, and the discriminatory laws in places like Russia and Poland, they forced hundreds of thousands of Jewish people to move to Britain. So I've mapped out here some possible ideas about what could go into some main paragraphs answering this question. So I thought about the things on the surface, which to do with the economic reasons people moved to Britain. I've then thought about the policy reasons why people moved to Britain. And then finally, I've thought about some of the religious factors that have led to migration. Okay, so I've then got a really nice plan to at least begin with before I start writing of some of the main topics I could write about. Okay, so you might want to get your textbooks out and actually think about, well, which factors am I going to want to write about for this question? Plan out what examples you could use to back them up. Okay, so we talked about iceberg planning. So that's going to give you your kind of like overall just ideas about what topics you're going to cover and then what your three main themes you're going to focus on. So in the case of the question we're talking about here, economics, and then two others of your choice. So we've planned out the basics for the overall essay. Now, the thing I want to talk about here is just very briefly on how to do a good introduction for this essay question, and then just an example of what a good main paragraph might look like. Okay, just so you can see what a top level paragraph would look like for this 16-mark question. Okay. Now, there's just a few key things that you really want to do with an introduction to this, and you really don't want to make your introduction too long. Okay, 2 or 3 sentences. Yeah, really not very much. You're not doing an A-level essay here. Okay, but you want to have some basic stuff. You want to make sure that you're making it clear what you're going to talk about. So thinking very carefully about what the question's actually asking you. You want to make sure you're using some of those key words from the question in your answer, because you want to make it clear that your argument is focused on exactly what the question's asking. So make sure that those key words you've underlined are being used throughout your comments in the introduction. Make it clear which factors you're going to focus about. So maybe you could just do one sentence on each one you're going to write about. And then finally, if you want to get in that top part of the mark band, you also want to, in your introduction, just have a sentence where you say, do you agree with what the question is saying, or do you think something else is more important? Okay. So in the case of this one I've done here, right, so my essay question is, have economic reasons been the main factor in the migration of people to Britain? Economic reasons have been the most important reason for the migration of people to Britain. Easy first sentence, makes it clear that I am going to agree with the question, that economic reasons have in fact been the main reasons people move to Britain. So that's a really clear introduction to start. It signposts to the person reading this essay where my argument's going to be going, and then they're going to see, well, okay, this is what he's claiming. Is he going to sustain that now? Now, I'm then going to talk about the other factors I'm going to write about those. So again, I've signposted, right, I'm going to argue that economic reasons are the most important, but what other factors below the surface am I going to write about? So I'm just going to have a sentence about each of them. Other factors like technology have also played a role in facilitating the easy movement of people to Britain. Likewise, government policy has also been a very important factor in migration to Britain. So I just made it clear what my other two factors I'm going to write about are. Overall, though, we will see that economic reasons have been the most important driving factor in most of the waves of migration to Britain. Okay, so I've just made it really clear what I'm going to argue and then what the other two factors I'm going to look at are. Now, I'm just going to show you here an example very quickly of a model paragraph, just so you can see, like, this is kind of like the standard you should be going for if you want to get a high mark on this paper. Okay, now I've got a little checklist here, which is also going to be on a worksheet, which I'll put in the video description again, which you can use to plan your essay. Okay, now let me just take that away for a minute. There's 4 key things I want to make sure that you got in your main paragraphs here. Okay, now the first thing, and it's probably the most important thing in some ways with these paragraphs in this main essay, is you want to make sure that you've got a good topic sentence. Okay, so some of you might think of it as a point sentence. That's fine. But a topic sentence, it makes it clear what's the topic of this paragraph, what's it about. Now, what I would say with a topic sentence for this essay question is you've got to make sure you include keywords from the question, and then you've got to make it very clear what the focus of the paragraph is. Okay, so if we're thinking about this one here, we've got technology has not been the most important factor in causing migration to Britain, but it has contributed to it in several cases. So I have clearly used the keywords from the question there, and I've made it very clear what the focus is going to be. It's going to be on the idea of technology contributing to migration to Britain. Okay. Now, the other thing you've got to make sure you do with your knowledge, as we saw in the mark scheme, is you've got to have a range of knowledge. So that means you've got to make sure that you've got examples that cover a big range of the course. So, for example, if all of your examples for migration were from the 1800s, you wouldn't be able to get into level 3 or 4 for your knowledge because it would be considered too narrow. Okay, so you want to make sure that you've got 2 or 3 different examples of migration or empires that cover a wide range of the course, and make sure that when you're planning, you're thinking about covering as many years as you can. Okay, so in the case of this one, I'm going to be talking about the role of technology when it came to the Vikings, and then I'm going to be talking at the other extreme end of the course about the role of technology in facilitating post-war migration. Okay, so you've got to make sure that you've got examples that cover a range of the years. Likewise, you want to make sure that you have got specific and precise evidence to back up your points. Okay, so it's one thing having a range of examples, but do you know names? Do you know dates? Do you know specific examples? Okay, I've underlined some of the examples of those in here. We'll read through it in a second. Okay, so make sure you've got lots of depth in your knowledge, in your explanations. Okay, and the final thing is you want to make sure that you finish with a nice link sentence at the end of your paragraph where you just re-emphasize the point of your paragraph, and then or if you want to, you might want to do that as well as introducing what your next paragraph is going to be about. That's a slightly more sophisticated thing, but just re-emphasizing the point of the paragraph. A good link sentence will often be quite similar to a good topic sentence. Okay, you're going to be kind of concluding the paragraph in some ways. It holds it together like a burger. You've got your two buns, it holds the thing together. Okay, so let's just have a quick read through this example one, just so you can see what a good paragraph looks like. Okay, so technology has not been the most important factor in causing migration to Britain, but it has contributed to it in several cases. For example, the Viking raids and their migration to Britain after the 793 raids on Lindisfarne were facilitated by their longboats. Viking longboats were a new cutting-edge piece of technology in Dark Ages Europe, 33 feet long and able to survive in the strong currents of the North Sea. They were crucial in Viking attacks and then the settlement of England. Without the longboats, the Vikings would have found it much harder to mass migrate across the North Sea and settle in Britain. Now, a couple of key things just about that first part of that paragraph there. So like we said there, we've got our topic sentence here, which use keywords from the question. We've then got some evidence to back it up. So I'm going to go through I've given some examples of the Vikings and how the technology of the longboat allowed them to migrate to Britain. But the other thing I've also got to make sure to do, remember we saw that you also get marked on your explanations, okay? So I'm not just describing a bunch of facts I know about when the Vikings came to Britain, or that's really good, about the size of their longboats. I then got to link it back to the question, which is about why people have migrated to Britain. So once I've given my key facts about the Vikings and why they migrated in terms of like the role of technology, I then say they were crucial in Viking attacks and then settlement to England. Without the longboats, the Vikings would have found it much harder to mass migrate across the North Sea and settle in Britain. So I've actually explained my example as well. I've said, well, this is why this technology was important to people moving to Britain. Yeah, remember, you can't just describe a bunch of stuff you know. You then have to explain it and link it to what the question's asking you. Okay, I then go on to my another example. Another example of technology playing a role in facilitating mass migration was the invention of mass aviation after World War II. Plane travel made it much easier for colonial subjects from the Commonwealth to move to Britain than before the war. So I've got, again, a few key depths, keywords, so colonial subjects, Commonwealth, invention of mass aviation. I'm then going to explain, okay, so why was the invention of the aeroplane really important to post-war migration? Without the aeroplane, it is unlikely migration to the Commonwealth would have reached the levels it did by the 1960s, when 40,000 Caribbean migrants alone were arriving each year. So I've explained why the aeroplane was an important invention in facilitating migration after the war. I then got my nice concluding sentence where I say, right, technology played a role in making mass migration to Britain easier, but it was not the reason for the migration in the first place. As we will see, government policy and economic factors were more important in explaining this. So with my final sentence there, I have re-emphasised the point of the paragraph, which is technology facilitated migration in some cases. But I then also, and again, that's a slightly more sophisticated thing, I can then say, we will see these other factors were more important. So I've made it really clear, re-emphasising the point of the paragraph, and then I've linked it onto what I'm going to talk about next. So you're welcome to use that as a model. I will try and put that again in the video description as a Google Doc, so you can just have that separately, or you can just pause the video here and use this paragraph as a model. Now, the other thing I would recommend you do while you're practicing Year 11 is we talked about the fact that planning is more important than writing in some ways. This is just a little planning sheet that I've given my Year 11s in the past, which I think you might find useful. And the point about these planning paragraphs things is that you want to do, wherever you have these straight lines, you want to write in full sentences in draft, okay? So you write almost like you would in the actual essay. Now, with the dotted lines, though, all you're going to be doing is planning out the evidence you want to use in noted form, okay? So you're not writing out the full paragraph here. You're just writing a really good topic sentence. You're doing some bullet points of the evidence you're going to use in that paragraph. So you think about, right, if that's the topic sentence, what evidence am I going to use here? And then you can do a draft link sentence. Now, on this one, you can see I've given you a little checklist of things to make sure that you check that you've done before you then actually go to writing. So you can see here two examples of students who've done their plan. So this is their plan for their paragraph before they've written their full essay. Okay. So in the case of this one here, we've got topic sentence: economic reasons were the main factor in the migration of people to Britain throughout the years. Okay. So again, simple topic sentence, but makes it clear what the paragraph's about. Absolutely fine. You've then got here, not in full sentences, just some lists of the evidence. So there's no explanations, there's no full sentences, but they are planning out some specific steps and examples to use in their paragraph, in their writing, okay? Now, you obviously won't be able to do this in the real exam, but I think by planning like this, your writing will become a lot better. So I'd recommend planning like this before you get on with your essays today. So you're going to have your topic sentence, you're going to have your basic bullet points and some key evidence you're going to use. So here you can see 3 different examples for economics, Vikings, Caribbean migration, Irish migration, and just a few facts and figures and key facts that the student's going to use in that paragraph. And then we've got a nice link sentence. Therefore, economic factors played the largest role in the migration to Britain, even though government policy also played a part. And you can see at the end there, the student has looked at that checklist and ticked off, yep, have I done each of those things? Yes, I have. So I would strongly recommend planning your main paragraphs before you actually write them, okay? So you'll have your iceberg plan to give you your overall ideas for what's going to go in the essay. This is where you're going to go a bit more granular and actually plan out the evidence you're going to use in your paragraphs. Okay then, so year 11 then, so we had a look at the mark scheme, we talked about iceberg planning for your overall essay, and then we looked at those example introductions and paragraphs, and then also some tips about how to plan them, okay? Now, just some last minute tips about the overall structure. So remember, if you want to get a good level 3, level 4 essay, you need to have an introduction where you make it clear what your answer to the question is. So do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? What factors are you going to write about, besides the ones in the question? You then want to make sure that you've got at least 2 paragraphs. I think maybe when you're practicing in time conditions, start with 2. You might want to eventually get to 3 paragraphs. So that means you've got to do at least 1 paragraph on the factor that's stated in the question. So in the case of the example 1 we did there, economic reasons. You then got to have at a minimum, if you want to get 12 out of 16, a second paragraph about another factor, okay? I would recommend now, though, while you've got the time and it's not in time conditions, doing 3 paragraphs. So the 1 in the question and then 2 other factors, okay? Make sure that you have evidence that covers a range of years of the course. And again, that's why planning can be useful, to make sure you actually do that. So go through your book, plan out, right, what are some examples of economic migration that cover the length and breadth of the course, for example. And then finally, if you go into the planning sheet, which again is in the video description, I've given you a couple of tips about if you want to write a conclusion, how to do that well. I would say with this question that if you run out of time for conclusions, it's not the end of the world, because if you do a good introduction, that will make it clear what your overall argument is. But if you look in the video description in that planning PowerPoint sheet, you'll be able to find just a couple of tips about how to do a good conclusion. Okay, so I hope you found that useful, year 11. Like Mr. Morgan said in the other video, it's really useful for us to get feedback on these videos. So if you found parts of it particularly useful or not useful, if you could let your teachers know via Teams, that would be very helpful. Okay, anyway, have a lovely evening, and I look forward to seeing you soon, year 11.